Hi and welcome back. In today's session, we are going to do an introduction to MySQL. As I had promised earlier, we are going to have an opportunity to look at MySQL database before moving to working with Django models. This is going to help us appreciate what we are going to miss out when working with Django, because as we mentioned is that unlike other programming languages where you interact with a database by doing SQL queries, when it comes to Django, it behaves slightly different. We are not going to be doing SQL queries, but instead Django uses an ORM mapping method. We are going to see the kind of commands that we are going to be working with in Django that will be creating that interaction with the database. And of course, now that we are looking at an introduction to MySQL, we are going to do a number of queries that will help us appreciate the difference in the querying method. So this course is a bit brief as we are just going to do the just the introductory part of it. And of course, we are still going to work with a few commands here and there that will help us undertake the CRUD operations of a database. All right. So the first thing is looking at the introduction, whereby we have some definitions here to note and to see the differences of some key terminologies that you might come across. Okay, so the very first thing that we need to define is MySQL, and according to this definition here, we see that MySQL is an open source relational database management system that allows you to store, manage, and retrieve data efficiently. Okay, so if you think of data, how we have been working with our code or with the data that so far we have worked with, in by default we said Django uses the db.sqli3 database. Okay, and that is where it will be storing the information. Of course, besides storing information, we should be able to retrieve the same information, go about manipulating the data and all that. Okay, but not to forget that we mentioned that db.sqli3 best works during development. But once you take you up to production, it's advisable to switch to a server-based database, of which you can make use of MySQL or Postgres SQL. All right. Then when dealing with anything to do with data, you hear something like SQL and no SQL. But in this case, we are going to look at MySQL versus NoSQL. And when these two are compared, we see that MySQL is a relational database that organizes data in tables using predefined schema. Okay, so this predefined schema simply means that even before you store your data to a MySQL database or a Postgres database, you will have defined the columns. Okay, you will have defined the username, first name, last name, age, and all that. All right. But when you talk about a NoSQL database, this is a non-relational database that allows for flexible and structured and semi-structured data. Okay, when you try to look at the difference between these two, when you want to store some data in MySQL 1, you will first of all define the columns. All right, and these columns could be examples of ID, first name, second name, age or date of birth, and all that. Okay, such that whenever you want to insert data in that database for the said columns, if a column has some missing data, you must mention that and provide some missing data using some quotes, either single quotes or double quotes. But then in a NoSQL database, instead of defining the columns, you just provide a field that will be fed with data. So in such a case that you want to save the ID, first name, last name, and age, and it happens that a certain row, but for the purpose of NoSQL, we call them documents. For the purpose of a certain document, in other words, a record, and it happens that that record does not have the age. You do not need to mention the age to provide an empty string. You just drop it. And that's the key difference between MySQL and NoSQL. All right. So the next thing is looking at definition of terms. These are the key terms that we are going to be interacting with. So the very first one, we talk about a database, which is a structured collection of data stored in a computer system. Okay, that's simply the definition of a database. All right, and we see that in MySQL, a database is a container for storing tables, views, triggers, procedures, and other database objects. Of course, now that we are doing this with a focus in Django, we are going to be dealing with tables. All right. And what are tables? We see that a table is how the data is organized in rows and columns. And we see that each row will represent a record and each column will represent a field. All right. So looking at what we have here, we have this as a table. Okay. We are going to be using table to store data that share some common characteristics. Okay. So in this case, the data that you see here has an ID, first name, last name, and age. So this correction is what we are terming as a table. All right. So moving on to the next term, we have a row, which again is a single horizontal record in a table. Okay. So looking at this table that we have here, this is a row. Okay. This is another one. All right, so whatever you see here, these are rows. So the next thing is a column. And again, we see that a column defines a vertical field in a table. Okay, so of course we have the attributes, like we have the name, the age, and email. Okay, and each column has a specific data type, such as integer, vulture, date, boolean, etc. Okay, so looking at this table here, this is a column. Okay, this is another one, this one, another, and this is another column. And of course, each and every column will have a name. All right. So for rows, a row might not necessarily have a name, but the best practices when defining a database table is defining something that we are going to call a primary key, and that will uniquely identify a row. Okay, because for the columns they are uniquely identified using these names. Okay, we do not expect to get another column within this table with the same name. All right, similarly for rows, we are going to look at something we call a primary key that will uniquely identify that particular row. All right, so these are rows, okay, and these are columns, first name, last name, and age. All right, so seeing the next thing is the primary key, which again is a unique identifier for each record or row in a table. Okay, so if you call a record with ID 2, we should only have one record, all right, with that ID. Okay, of course, in this case, I'm using this ID as the primary key because it is a common practice. Then we have a foreign key, which happens to be a field or a set of fields in one table that uniquely identifies a row of another table. Okay, in this case, we see that it creates a relationship between two tables and enforces referential integrity. All right, so referencing this table here, Okay, if we happen to come up with another table, say another table of contributions, all right, and those who are to contribute are the members that we see here, then we can create one column here and name it a foreign key that will reference at least the primary key in this table. Because again, we say that for the primary key, it will uniquely identify a record. All right. Then for a foreign key, we have said is a field in one table that uniquely identifies a row of another table. Okay. So whatever is being referenced should as well be unique. Okay, so that in our contributions table, we do not need to kind of copy and paste every other piece of information. We just need to reference the person with the first name Aris, last name Johnson, and the age 25 with this ID. So when we reference this in another table, then we term that as the foreign key. All right. Okay, so the next thing that we can appreciate when talking about databases is data types. All right, so this is something else that we are going to see when talking about models. So the very first data type, we see that it's an integer. Okay, and an integer, we see that it stores whole numbers between the given range. All right. Okay. So the thing to appreciate is what or how Django deals with data types when it comes to dealing with models. All right. So for now, as far as MySQL is concerned, we have that data type called int. Okay, standing in for integer. All right. So the next data type we have vulture, and when you think of strings, this should store strings, but then we see that when you talk of vulture and you pass in a number, whatever you pass in here, that should be the maximum it can allow you to store in that field. Okay. Then for text, when you are talking about a large variable length string, in case think of a blog post, which has say 3, 5, 10 paragraphs. So again, you can think of that as text. All right. Of course, these are strings as well, but now the length has increased. All right. The next type of data type we have the dates. Again, we see we have a special format that has to be followed. So once you define your table columns and you talk of date, then it has to conform to a particular formatting. All right. Then we have date and time. So in here we are passing both the date and time elements. All right. And of course, again, we see that we have a format to follow. Okay. The other data type we have Boolean. All right, we see that this represents either true or false. Okay, and you can define true as this true or false, and they can also be represented by 1 and 0. So that's another data type that we are going to interact with when we are talking about models. All right. So finally, in this page, we have enum. Again, this is enumeration and it is used to store a predefined set of values. All right, think of you have a column and it is supposed to store the size. Okay, and for the size, you only have three sizes, that is small, medium, and large. So you can talk of enumerate and provide such values so that whichever data that is to be captured, it should be one of what has been provided. All right. So that's the brief introduction of the MySQL bit. Okay, so coming soon, we are now going to interact and see just a few things that you need to appreciate when it comes to dealing with a MySQL database.